To be a multicultural educator to me means that I'm going to, as a teacher or an educator, start with the identities and the backgrounds and the cultures of my students, and using that as the jumping off point for all that we're doing. But also at the same time thinking about that idea of windows and mirrors. And so wanting to make sure that I'm giving them an opportunity to see themselves in the curriculum and what we're doing, so it's a mirror back to them, but also making sure that they're seeing windows into other worlds and other cultures as well. And the critical piece about being a critical multicultural educator, to me that has to do with the idea that we're going to be aware of social issues in the world. And so we're not going to necessarily think, okay, yes, we're all different and that's it, and it's great, beautiful, but that we're going to talk about issues that come up because of those cultures and differences, that the world is not going to treat everybody the same, and we need to be aware of that and figure out how we're going to handle it. I think one of the things that I do that I would say makes me an anti-racist or critical multicultural educator is a lot of revision of ways that schooling is supposed to be, revising the way I think about how a teacher is supposed to be, revising the way students are supposed to be, and revising the way the curriculum is set up and delivered to students. And so I always want to be making changes to kind of that traditional structure and traditional content so that it centers the students' voices and who they are. And so on a day-to-day basis, that could mean I'm looking at a unit and saying, I'm supposed to be teaching XYZ, but that really has nothing to do with my students' lives and what they're going through and what they see in the world. And so how can I change that to show exactly who they are, and how can they bring their stories into what we're talking about? I feel like the Common Core standards get a little bit of a bad rap where people kind of say, oh, we have to teach this thing. But if you actually read them, they're very broad, and they say that you have to teach certain things, but they don't say anything about how you have to teach them. And so, yes, I'm supposed to teach students how to figure out tricky words, right, and context clues. But I could use, the boring old text that has been used 100 times, or we can use something that's actually going to resonate with students. Using Jacqueline Woodson's text, she uses so much rich language and figurative language. And so that's a great text that a lot of my students connect with that I can use to implement or to teach those Common Core standards that, I am supposedly held accountable towards. To develop students' academic identities, I try to use their voices as much as possible. So if there's any time where I can have a student do something, I try to have them do it as opposed to me. If that means I'm going to have them lead the class in moving from one room to the other, that can be that. But another thing that I like to do is have them sharing their work on a constant basis. And so at the end of our work period, students are able to showcase what they've done. In math, we have math congresses where students come together, and instead of me teaching them, hey, this is how you're going to multiply, hey, this is how you're going to divide the fractions, I say, hey, what did you do to multiply? What did you do to divide fractions? And then we start with them sharing their strategies. And so I'm valuing their knowledge, and so really they see themselves as the producers of knowledge versus me delivering this content to them. We do a lot of identity work at the beginning of the school year to help students to develop their social identities. And not so much develop them as if they are not there, but help develop them in the sense that they learn that they are welcome in school and that who they are is going to be important and valued in the classroom. And so we have a lot of conversations at the beginning of the year about who are we and what does that mean? What are the identities that we have, and how do they show up in our classroom? How do they show up in the world? How do they show up in our curriculum? And so it's important that students know who they are before we even get to a lot of the important content, because then if they're not sure who they are, then it can make the conversations about content later in the year much more challenging. I would say I understand where students are, and I can socially, when they're able to articulate for themselves who they are. Not necessarily me telling them, oh, like, don't you think you might be kind of like this? But when I can say, tell me who you are, and they're able to just kind of go on and say the different positive things about them, whether they're academic or social or cultural identities, whatever those are. I love when students can just answer that question of who are you and how do you identify? If they can do that independently, then I feel like we're on a really good track to start the year. I'm fortunate in my teaching context because I do teach in New York City, and so there are tons of different people when you're walking down the street or when you're just kind of out and about in New York City. But a lot of times students are coming from communities that are segregated because New York City is so segregated. So there are times where racial differences or cultural differences can come to a head in the school context. And so it's important that when those situations arise, that we talk with each other and the students learn to have conversations about difference. And I find that it's easier for students to respect other people and other people's differences when they themselves have a strong sense of self and a strong love of self. Because if they love themselves, then it's much easier for them to care about other people, and they can start to see how important that is. One of the measures that I use to see how students are doing on their respect for other students is how well they're able to stand up as an ally. I feel like there have been moments where students where a sticky situation might happen and they might not necessarily know how to deal with it. But if students are able to stand up for a friend maybe that has been targeted for some part of their identity, then I feel like they are making significant progress. To develop students' social justice conscience, I would say that I use current events as a huge jumping off point. And if I can bridge current events with the historical content that I'm being asked to teach in social studies, then I feel like students are able to be more conscious about the world because they can see patterns and systems of oppression that have happened historically and how they're perpetuated today. And when they can see that it's not just this one little thing that's unfair that happened, that it's this long history of injustice in our country, then they're able to be more aware on a deeper level as opposed to just thinking it's an isolated incident. One of the ways that I like to encourage students to take action for social justice is making sure that they have that strong identity. They've also developed a strong understanding of issues in our world that are happening right now, whether it's police brutality, whether it's gun violence, whatever that issue may be. And I find that when students have a strong identity and they have a strong awareness of what's going on in the world, then naturally they feel compelled to take social action. They don't need that much of an invitation. Sometimes you just have to remind them, hey, you can do this, and that's enough to kind of get the ball rolling. And so I found that students will then take the initiative to create their own projects. And I will support them and scaffold them in doing that. But I've had students that have made blogs about asthma and the consequences of smoking for their community. I've had students that have made videos about police brutality to post on a blog, or students that have made pins about gender violence. And so all of that was rooted in conversations we had about current events and conversations we had about identity, and those combined make it so that they want to take social action independent of whether I'm there or not. One of my greatest successes as a teacher was when I had a student that was really resistant to a reading identity. He kind of, many years before he even came to my classroom, he kind of had created this, version of himself that he was a non-reader, and reading wasn't really for him. He didn't like reading. He was a math guy. And so when we were having book clubs and we were starting these, this new unit, he was, a bit resistant to working with the other students. He was a bit resistant to the book choices that they had. Kind of none of them were a good fit for him. And so we were talking about who had a strong reading identity in his life. And he was really proud to talk on and on about his grandmother and how she was an amazing reader. She even read the news after watching the news, which baffled him. And so when he finally did decide on a book to read, I said, hey, you could take a book home to grandma, and she could be part of your book club. And so I think as a critical multicultural educator, it's important to be really flexible and to change our mindsets of what is supposed to happen. Because I found that when I opened up our classroom and our book clubs for grandmas, it was really powerful for him, and he was suddenly able to be an incredible leader in our classroom. And he was telling me what I needed to read. He was telling grandma what she needed to read, and we had our assignments and the notes that we needed to take. And so it was really powerful to see that when I let go of what I thought a teacher was supposed to be in solving these issues of reading in the four walls, and when I opened up that concept to his family, to his community, to who was important in his life, then he was a much more successful reader, and he was able to step into a newer identity for himself. A time I felt proud of myself is when I was able to let go of the control of being a teacher. Because I think when you see movies of teaching, or the teaching that I experienced as a kid growing up, the teacher stands in front of the room and tells you guys what you're supposed to do, and you are supposed to learn. But I've tried to really work on turning that around. And I feel most proud of my students when I am able to literally just sit in the back and be quiet, and they are able to just continue on without me, because that's when I see that I've been the most successful. When they're able to continue a lesson and take control of it. When they have someone who's doing the writing, they have someone who's transitioning the kids from their seats to the rug. When they have someone that's facilitating the conversation, those are the moments that I'm most proud of my students, and then in turn, most proud of me. I think one of my greatest challenges as a classroom teacher is one that we all have as classroom teachers, which is time. And I feel like I never have enough time to do all the stuff I want to do with students. And so sometimes that can manifest itself where I feel like I'm a little bit too much like, okay, come on, let's go, we've got to do this. And so I sometimes have to center myself and remind myself of the student in front of me, who they are, making sure I think about their humanity, and then not worry about all of the other kind of baggage I have as a teacher. And when I can kind of separate that out, that's when I feel like I'm able to most overcome that challenge.
My next question, I feel like you kind of already answered it, but let me ask it.
Yeah.
How does your commitment to multicultural education and social justice help you to mitigate the challenges?
The challenges
of being a classroom teacher.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah, let's see. So the biggest challenge I face as a classroom teacher is time, but I find that being a social justice educator means that I try not to focus on that as much, and I try to focus on the humanity and the person that is, and the student that is sitting or standing in front of me. And if I can focus on who they are, what do they need from me in that moment, then I can start to have a stronger impact on them that has less to do with, the time pressure that I always am feeling in the back of my mind as a teacher. I'm lucky that my current school context, this is important to most of the staff. A lot of us have really made changes over the last few years to kind of all work towards this. We've had a lot of, we've read books together, we've had trainings together, we've had conversations together. And so I've been really fortunate to be in a community to do this work, because when you're in a community to do this work, it's so much easier. I would say one of the challenges about being a critical multicultural educator in my personal life is that sometimes I feel like people see me as kind of like a savior, and they kind of apply this like white savior complex onto me that I try not to embrace, and I try to push back on when I am kind of given those comments. So when when people kind of outside, or if I talk about the work that I'm doing, if anyone is saying like, oh, well, that's so good on you, they really need you, I try to really resist those comments and say, actually, no, there's a lot of teachers out there that are doing this work as well. And there's a lot of teachers of color that are doing this work as well that is not recognized. So, thank you for the compliment, but I don't accept it as a total compliment. So I see teaching as a political act, and it's something that is very intentional. And oftentimes I feel like there are some teachers who might be a little bit afraid of a political identity or afraid to take a stance. But I always try to encourage them that if you are not engaging critical multicultural education or social justice education, whatever you want to call it, by not doing that, you are engaging in a stance, and that you are perpetuating systems of oppression that have existed in our society and our school system for years. And so you might be thinking that you're neutral, but there really is no neutral in education, and that you actually need to be actively working towards multicultural critical education in order to, be the kind of calm, peaceful, neutral teacher you think you would like to be.